Sometimes the most ordinary Tuesday morning can become the day that reshapes your entire understanding of strength, justice, and human resilience. What started as workplace harassment in a small-town diner would become a viral moment that sparked conversations across the nation about standing up to bullies, the power of self-defense, and why sometimes the most unexpected people become the heroes we never knew we needed. Sara Martinez never considered herself a fighter. At 24, she was just trying to make ends meet, working double shifts at Murphy's Diner while studying for her nursing degree. She had dealt with difficult customers before, rude comments, and the occasional inappropriate gesture. But nothing had prepared her for what would happen on that humid August morning when a regular customer's harmless prank would push her past her breaking point. The security camera footage would later be viewed millions of times. The incident would make national news. Legal experts would debate it on television. But before all of that, before the lawyers and the interviews and the internet fame, there was just a young woman trying to do her job and a man who thought he could humiliate her for his own amusement. This is the story of 3 seconds that changed 2 lives forever. 3 seconds that would force a small town to confront uncomfortable truths about power, respect, and what happens when someone finally says enough. 3 seconds that prove sometimes the quietest people have the strongest voices, and sometimes justice comes not from a courtroom, but from a perfectly timed right hook that echoes around the world. What you're about to read isn't just about one moment of violence or one viral video. It's about the events that led up to that moment, the aftermath that nobody saw coming, and how a bucket of ice water and one woman's refusal to be victimized became a catalyst for change in ways no one could have predicted. Sara Martinez had always been the type of person who avoided confrontation. Her mother used to joke that Sara would apologize to a door if she walked into it. At Murphy's Diner on the corner of Main Street and Cedar Avenue in the small town of Millbrook, this tendency to keep her head down and push through difficult situations had served her well for the past 18 months. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid her bills and gave her the flexible schedule she needed to attend nursing school 3 days a week. The diner was one of those places that felt frozen in time, with its red vinyl booths, checkered floor, and the persistent smell of coffee that had been brewing since 1987. Sara knew every regular customer by name, their usual orders, and their quirks. There was Mrs. Henderson who always ordered her eggs over easy but sent them back if the yolks were even slightly runny. There was Tommy the truck driver who came in every Thursday at exactly 6:30 in the morning and ordered the same thing: black coffee, wheat toast, and scrambled eggs with extra cheese. And then there was Derek Paulson. Derek had been coming to Murphy's for about 6 months, usually arriving around 10 in the morning when the breakfast rush was winding down. He was 42 years old, worked construction for his uncle's company, and had the kind of personality that filled a room whether people wanted it filled or not. Derek was loud, crude, and seemed to think that his status as a regular customer gave him special privileges that included making inappropriate comments to the female staff. Sara's first encounter with Derek had been relatively mild. He had made a comment about her smile and how it brightened up his whole day. She had responded politely, as she did with all customers, but something about the way he looked at her made her uncomfortable. Over the weeks that followed, Derek's comments became bolder. He would ask personal questions about her life, make remarks about her appearance, and sometimes reach across the counter in ways that invaded her personal space. The other waitresses had warned Sara about Derek. Maria, who had worked at Murphy's for 15 years, pulled Sara aside after Derek's 3rd visit and told her to be careful. "That one thinks he owns whatever he looks at," Maria had said, refilling the sugar dispensers with more force than necessary. "I've seen his type before. They start with compliments and work their way up to thinking they can take whatever they want." Sara appreciated the warning, but she also needed her job. She had student loans to pay, rent due on the 1st of every month, and a dream of becoming a registered nurse that required her to stay in school. She couldn't afford to make waves with customers, even uncomfortable ones. So she developed strategies for dealing with Derek. She would assign him to tables in Maria's section when possible. When she had to serve him directly, she kept conversations strictly professional and avoided being alone in his presence. For a while, this approach seemed to work. Derek continued his inappropriate comments, but he stayed within the bounds of what could be dismissed as crude humor rather than outright harassment. Sarah told herself she could handle it. She had handled worse things in her life. Growing up in a single-parent household where her mother worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table had taught her resilience. Her father had left when she was 8, and she had learned early that some battles weren't worth fighting if they threatened your stability. But Derek Paulson was not a man who accepted boundaries gracefully. The escalation began in early July. Derek started arriving at the diner during Sarah's shifts, specifically asking other customers to switch tables so he could sit in her section. He began bringing her small gifts, a flower picked from someone's garden, a candy bar from the gas station, a lottery ticket he claimed was lucky. Sarah accepted these offerings politely but tried to make it clear that she was just doing her job. She mentioned her boyfriend, Tom, in conversation whenever she could, hoping Derek would take the hint that she wasn't available or interested. Instead, Derek seemed to interpret her politeness as encouragement. "That boyfriend of yours doesn't know how lucky he is," Derek said one morning in late July, stirring his coffee with exaggerated slowness. "If I had a girl like you, I'd never let her out of my sight." Sarah refilled his cup and moved to the next table, but Derek continued talking. "I bet he doesn't appreciate you the way I would," Derek said, his voice loud enough for other customers to hear. "I bet he doesn't even know what he's got." Other customers began to notice Derek's behavior. Mr. Jameson, a retired teacher who came in every morning for coffee and a blueberry muffin, made a point of sitting at the counter where he could keep an eye on Sarah's interactions with Derek. The younger construction workers who sometimes accompanied Derek to the diner began to look uncomfortable with his comments, occasionally telling him to knock it off or give the girl a break. But Derek seemed to feed off the attention, both positive and negative. He began to view Sarah as a challenge to be conquered rather than a person to be respected. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in early August. Sarah had worked a double shift the day before, covering for Maria, who had called in sick with the flu. She had gotten home at midnight, studied for a pharmacology exam until 2 in the morning, and was back at work by 6 a.m. to open the diner. She was exhausted, stressed about her upcoming exam, and running on 3 cups of coffee and determination. Derek arrived at his usual time, but instead of sitting at his regular table, he chose a booth directly next to the kitchen door where Sarah had to pass every time she picked up an order. Each time she walked by, he made a comment or found a reason to stand up, so she had to squeeze past him. When she brought him his breakfast, he grabbed her wrist as she set down his plate. "You know, Sarah, you look tired," Derek said, his grip firm enough that she couldn't pull away without making a scene. "Maybe you need someone to take better care of you. Someone who appreciates what he's got." Sarah felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. The diner was full of customers, including several people she knew from around town. She could feel them watching, waiting to see how she would handle the situation. In that moment, she had 2 choices: she could make a scene and risk her job, or she could continue to endure Derek's behavior and hope it eventually stopped. She chose the path she had always chosen. She gently pulled her wrist free and continued with her work. But something had changed in that moment. A line had been crossed, and both Sarah and Derek knew it. The dynamic between them had shifted from uncomfortable customer interaction to something more dangerous. Derek had tested her boundaries and found that he could push further than he had before. And Sarah, despite her attempts to remain professional, had reached a level of anger that she didn't know existed within her quiet, conflict-avoiding personality. After Derek left that morning, Sarah found herself shaking as she cleaned his table. The other waitresses noticed her distress, but there wasn't much they could say. Everyone who worked in customer service had stories about difficult patrons. Everyone had learned to smile and endure behavior that would be unacceptable in any other context. But, as Sarah wiped down Derek's table and stacked his dishes, she made a decision that would change everything. She decided that the next time Derek Paulson crossed a line, she wouldn't just endure it. She would be ready. She didn't know what form that readiness would take. She didn't plan what would happen. But deep inside her quiet, accommodating exterior, something fierce and protective was awakening. Something that had been shaped by years of taking care of herself, by the strength her mother had shown in raising her alone, by the determination that had gotten her through high school and into college despite every obstacle. Sarah Martinez was done being a victim. She just didn't know it yet. The next morning, Derek Paulson would walk into Murphy's Diner carrying a bucket of ice water and a cruel sense of humor. He would see Sarah behind the counter, tired from another long shift, focused on her work and her dreams of a better future. He would see what he thought was an easy target, a quiet girl who wouldn't fight back. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. As Sarah finished her shift that Tuesday evening, she had no idea that in less than 24 hours, a 3-second encounter would make her famous, change her life forever, and force an entire community to confront the difference between staying quiet and standing up. She had no idea that the quiet storm that had been building inside her was about to break with the force of a hurricane. All she knew was that she was tired of being afraid, tired of being treated like she didn't matter, and tired of letting other people define the boundaries of her own dignity. Tomorrow, Derek Paulson would learn that some people are quiet not because they're weak, but because they're choosing their battles. And, when they finally choose to fight, they fight to win. Wednesday morning arrived with an oppressive humidity that made the air feel thick enough to swim through. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts about her upcoming exam and replaying yesterday's encounter with Derek. She arrived at Murphy's Diner at 5:30 a.m., 30 minutes before her shift officially started, hoping the extra time would help her feel more prepared for whatever the day might bring. The diner felt different in the pre-dawn darkness. Without the bustling energy of customers and the constant clatter of dishes, it was almost peaceful. Sarah used the quiet time to set up her station, fill sugar dispensers, and review her nursing notes one more time before the morning rush began. She was memorizing medication dosages when she heard the bell above the front door chime. Her heart sank when she looked up and saw Derek Paulson standing in the doorway, 20 minutes earlier than his usual arrival time. But something was different about him today. Instead of his typical construction clothes and work boots, he was wearing clean jeans and a button-down shirt that looked like he had made an effort to dress nicely. More unsettling, he was carrying a large plastic bucket filled with what appeared to be ice water. "Morning, beautiful," Derek called out, his voice echoing in the empty diner. "Hope you're ready for a good day." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but she maintained her professional composure. "Good morning, Derek. You're early today. The grill won't be ready for another few minutes." Derek set the bucket down near the entrance and took his usual table, but his behavior was different from previous visits. He seemed energized, almost excited, like someone who was anticipating something special. He kept glancing at the bucket and then at Sarah, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that made her deeply uncomfortable. "Oh, I'm not here for food right away," Derek said, leaning back in his booth with an air of confidence that seemed new and aggressive. "I've got something special planned for today. Something that's going to cool you right down." Sarah tried to focus on her opening duties, but Derek's presence filled the diner with tension. She could feel him watching her every movement, and the bucket by the door seemed to loom larger with each passing moment. When other customers began to arrive for the early breakfast shift, Sarah felt a small measure of relief. Surely Derek wouldn't do anything inappropriate with witnesses around. She was wrong. The morning progressed normally for the first hour. Derek ordered his usual breakfast and coffee, made his typical inappropriate comments, and generally behaved as he had for months. But Sarah noticed he kept checking his watch and glancing toward the bucket. Around 8:15, when the breakfast rush was in full swing and Sarah was moving quickly between tables, Derek stood up and walked toward the bucket. "Hey Sarah," Derek called out loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "You look like you're working up a sweat over there. Maybe you need to cool down." Sarah was refilling coffee cups at a table of construction workers when she heard Derek's comment. She looked up to see him lifting the bucket of ice water, a broad grin on his face that sent alarm bells ringing in her head. The other customers in the diner began to notice the strange scene unfolding, conversation stopping as people turned to watch. "Derek, please put that down," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm and professional despite the panic rising in her chest. "I'm working. I need to take care of my customers." But Derek was already moving toward her, the bucket held high like he was preparing to douse her with its contents. The ice water sloshed dangerously close to the rim as he approached, and Sarah realized with horror that he was actually planning to dump it on her in front of everyone. Come on, Sarah, don't be such a spoilsport, Derek said, his voice taking on a cruel edge that she had never heard before. It's all in good fun. You need to learn to loosen up a little. The construction workers at the table where Sarah had been serving coffee began to shift uncomfortably. One of them, a man named Pete who had always been polite and respectful, started to stand up as if he might intervene. But Derek was moving too fast, and the situation was escalating too quickly for anyone to process what was really happening. Sarah backed toward the counter, her heart pounding as she realized that Derek was serious about his intention to humiliate her in front of the entire diner. She could see the anticipation in his eyes, the cruel satisfaction he was getting from her fear and discomfort. In that moment, she understood that this wasn't really about cooling her down or playing a harmless prank. This was about power. This was about Derek demonstrating that he could do whatever he wanted to her, and she would have to take it. Derek, stop, Sarah said more firmly, her back against the coffee station with nowhere else to retreat. This isn't funny. Please just sit down and finish your breakfast. But Derek had passed the point of no return. He was committed to his plan, energized by the audience and the opportunity to assert his dominance over the young woman who had been politely rejecting his advances for months. He raised the bucket higher, ice water ready to cascade down on Sarah's head and uniform. Time to cool down, sweetheart, Derek said, and began to tip the bucket forward. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as happening almost too fast to follow, but also with a strange clarity that made every detail unforgettable. As the ice water began to pour from the bucket, Sarah felt something inside her snap. All the months of enduring Derek's inappropriate comments, all the times she had bitten her tongue and smiled politely while he made her uncomfortable, all the anger she had suppressed in the name of professionalism and keeping her job suddenly crystallized into a moment of perfect, focused rage. The first splash of ice water hit her face and soaked through her uniform shirt, shocking her system with its cold intensity. But instead of the reaction Derek was expecting, embarrassment, tears, or helpless anger, Sarah did something that surprised everyone in the diner, including herself. She stepped forward instead of backing away. As Derek continued to pour the water, Sarah moved directly toward him, closing the distance between them instead of trying to escape. The ice water cascaded over her head and shoulders, but she didn't flinch or cry out. Instead, she looked directly into Derek's eyes with an expression that made him suddenly uncertain about his choice to humiliate her. "You think this is funny?" Sarah said, her voice calm despite the water dripping from her hair and the fury burning in her chest. Derek, apparently realizing that Sarah's reaction wasn't what he had expected, tried to laugh it off. "Come on, Sarah, it's just a joke. Don't get all worked up about it." But Sarah was no longer the quiet, accommodating waitress who had been enduring his behavior for months. The ice water had done more than shock her system, it had washed away the last of her patience and her willingness to be victimized for the comfort of others. "A joke?" Sarah repeated, water still dripping from her face. "You think humiliating me in front of everyone is a joke?" The diner had gone completely silent. Every customer was watching the confrontation unfold, sensing that something significant was happening but not sure what they were witnessing. Derek still held the empty bucket, his confident smile beginning to fade as he realized that Sarah wasn't reacting the way he had anticipated. "Look, I was just trying to have some fun," Derek said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. "You're taking this way too seriously." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, ice water dripping steadily onto the diner floor. In that pause, she made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. She decided that Derek Paulson had humiliated her for the last time. She decided that no one would ever again mistake her quiet demeanor for weakness. She decided that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to show them that their victims could fight back. "You want to know what's funny?" Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent diner. "What's funny is that you think you can treat me like this and I'll just take it." Derek opened his mouth to respond, probably to dismiss her concerns or make another joke at her expense. But he never got the chance to speak. Sarah drew her right arm back, put all of her anger and frustration and months of suppressed rage behind it, and threw a punch that connected with Derek's jaw with a sound that echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Derek Paulson, who had spent months intimidating and harassing a young woman who he thought was too weak to fight back, dropped to the floor like a sack of concrete. The empty bucket clattered beside him as he lay unconscious on the checkered linoleum, his mouth slightly open and his eyes closed. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood over Derek's unconscious form, her chest heaving and her knuckles throbbing, as the reality of what she had just done began to sink in. She had never hit anyone in her life. She had never even raised her voice in anger before today. But Derek Paulson had pushed her past every boundary she had ever set for herself, and now he was lying unconscious on the floor of Murphy's Diner while ice water evaporated around him. The first sound to break the silence was applause. Pete, the construction worker who had started to stand up when Derek approached Sarah with the bucket, began clapping slowly. Within seconds, the entire diner erupted in cheers and applause that could be heard 3 blocks away. Customers were standing at their tables, whistling and shouting their approval for the young waitress who had finally given Derek Paulson what everyone thought he deserved. Sarah looked around at the crowd of people celebrating her moment of violence, and, for the first time in months, she smiled a real, genuine smile. She was soaked, shaking, and probably unemployed, but she felt more like herself than she had in years. Derek Paulson would wake up 5 minutes later with a sore jaw and a bruised ego. But Sarah Martinez had found something in that moment of confrontation that she didn't know she possessed, the knowledge that she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. The 5 minutes that Derek Paulson lay unconscious on the floor of Murphy's Diner were the longest and most surreal of Sarah Martinez's life. As the applause died down and the reality of the situation began to set in, she found herself standing in the middle of a crowd of strangers who were looking at her like she had just performed some kind of miracle. But Sarah's mind wasn't on the praise or the attention. She was staring down at Derek's motionless form and wrestling with a mixture of emotions that ranged from satisfaction to terror. She had never hit anyone before, and seeing the man who had tormented her for months lying unconscious at her feet was both deeply satisfying and deeply frightening. "Is he dead?" asked Mrs. Henderson, leaning over her booth to get a better look at Derek's prone figure. "No, just knocked out cold," replied Pete, who had moved closer to check on Derek despite having no love for the man. "That was one hell of a punch, though." Maria burst through the kitchen doors, having heard the commotion from the prep area where she had been preparing for the lunch rush. When she saw Derek on the floor and Sarah standing over him, soaking wet and trembling, she immediately understood what had happened. "Oh honey," Maria said, rushing to Sarah's side. "What did you do?" "I hit him," Sarah said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "He dumped that bucket of ice water on me, and I hit him." Maria looked around the diner at the faces of the customers, all of whom were watching the scene with fascination. She had worked in food service long enough to know that this kind of incident could go very badly for Sarah, regardless of how justified her actions might have been. "We need to call someone," Maria said. "The police, maybe an ambulance." As if summoned by her words, Derek began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, and he made a confused groaning sound as he tried to remember where he was and what had happened to him. When he saw Sarah standing over him, the memory came rushing back, and his expression shifted from confusion to rage. "You crazy bitch," Derek said, struggling to sit up while holding his jaw. "You knocked me out. I'm going to sue you for everything you've got." The customers in the diner, who had been watching Derek's recovery with interest, immediately turned hostile at his words. Several people began shouting at him, telling him he deserved what he got and, worse. The atmosphere, which had been celebratory moments before, suddenly became tense and potentially dangerous. Everyone calmed down, called out Officer Mike Stevens, who had just walked through the front door of the diner. Officer Stevens was in his mid-30s, had grown up in Millbrook, and knew most of the people in the diner by name. He was also someone who had been dealing with complaints about Derek Paulson for years, though nothing had ever risen to the level of formal charges. Officer Stevens surveyed the scene, Derek sitting on the floor with a swelling jaw, Sarah standing nearby soaking wet, and 30 customers who all seemed ready to tell him exactly what had happened. "All right, what's going on here?" Officer Stevens asked, though he suspected he already knew the general outline of the story. The next 20 minutes were a chaos of competing narratives. Derek insisted that Sarah had assaulted him without provocation, demanding that she be arrested for assault and battery. Sarah, with quiet dignity that impressed everyone watching, explained that she had been defending herself after Derek dumped ice water on her as part of what he called a joke. But the real story emerged from the customers who had witnessed the entire incident. Pete, the construction worker, Mrs. Henderson, and half a dozen other people gave Officer Stevens detailed accounts of Derek's behavior not just that morning, but over the past several months. They described his inappropriate comments, his invasion of Sarah's personal space, and the clear pattern of harassment that had led up to the ice water incident. "Officer, that man has been bothering this poor girl for months," said Mrs. Henderson, pointing an accusatory finger at Derek. "We've all seen it. He thinks just because he's a customer he can say and do whatever he wants to her. She's been nothing but professional and polite, even when he was being disgusting," added Pete. "What happened today was him going too far, and she defended herself." Officer Stevens listened to all the accounts, took notes, and tried to sort through the legal implications of what had occurred. On one hand, Sarah had clearly struck Derek hard enough to knock him unconscious, which could technically be considered assault. On the other hand, Derek's behavior could be seen as harassment, and dumping ice water on someone could itself be considered assault. While Officer Stevens was gathering information, something else was happening that none of the people in Murphy's Diner were aware of. Janet Morrison, a customer who had been sitting in the corner booth near the window, had recorded the entire ice water incident and Sarah's response on her smartphone. She had originally taken out her phone to record what she thought was going to be a humiliating prank, but instead had captured the moment when Sarah fought back. Without thinking about the potential consequences, Janet posted the video to her social media accounts with the caption, "Local waitress stands up to workplace bully who thought dumping ice water on her would be funny. Guess he found out." Within an hour, the video had been shared hundreds of times. Within 3 hours, it had reached thousands of people. By the end of the day, millions of people around the world would see the moment when Sarah Martinez decided she wasn't going to be a victim anymore. But, back in Murphy's Diner, the immediate concern was what would happen to Sarah legally. Officer Stevens was in a difficult position. He had clear evidence that Derek had assaulted Sarah by dumping water on her, but he also had an unconscious man who had been knocked out by Sarah's punch. Derek, still sitting on the floor and holding his jaw, was insisting that charges be filed against Sarah. "I don't care what anyone says about what happened before," Derek said. "She knocked me unconscious. That's assault, and I want her arrested." Sarah, who had been mostly quiet during the police investigation, finally spoke up. "Officer Stevens, I know I shouldn't have hit him. But I couldn't take it anymore. He's been bothering me for months, and today he humiliated me in front of everyone. I just snapped." Officer Stevens looked at Sarah, then at Derek, then at the roomful of customers who were all clearly on Sarah's side. He had been a police officer for 12 years, and he had seen enough domestic violence cases and harassment situations to recognize the dynamics at play here. Derek Paulson was a bully who had finally picked on someone who fought back. "Derek, I'm going to ask you to leave," Officer Stevens said finally. "And if you come back here and bother this young lady again, I'll arrest you for harassment." "What about her hitting me?" Derek demanded. "Are you going to let her get away with assault?" Officer Stevens considered his options. Technically, he could arrest Sarah for assault. But he could also arrest Derek for his assault with the ice water. More importantly, he knew that if this case went to court, a jury of local people would side with Sarah overwhelmingly. "Derek, you dumped a bucket of ice water on her while she was working. That's assault too. You want to press charges against her, she can press charges against you. How do you think that's going to work out for you in court when all these witnesses testify about how you've been harassing her for months?" Derek looked around the diner at the hostile faces staring back at him. He was beginning to realize that his position wasn't as strong as he had initially thought. The people of Millbrook had seen his behavior, and they weren't sympathetic to his complaints about being knocked out. "This isn't over," Derek said, struggling to his feet and wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "I know people too. This isn't over." As Derek limped toward the door, several customers made comments that ranged from sarcastic to threatening. Pete the construction worker called out, "Hey Derek, maybe next time you'll think twice before messing with someone who can defend themselves." After Derek left, the atmosphere in the diner relaxed considerably. Customers went back to their breakfast conversations, but the topic was now entirely focused on what they had just witnessed. Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable, despite the supportive nature of the comments. Officer Stevens stayed for another few minutes to complete his report and to talk privately with Sarah about what had happened. "Sarah, I'm not going to file charges against you," he said quietly. "But you should know that Derek might try to cause trouble for you in other ways. He's got a temper, and he doesn't like being embarrassed." Sarah nodded, understanding the warning. She was beginning to realize that her moment of standing up for herself might have consequences that extended far beyond the diner. What she didn't know was that those consequences were already beginning to unfold in ways that none of them could have imagined. Janet Morrison's video was spreading across the internet faster than any news story in Millbrook's history. Television news producers in 3 different states had already seen the footage and were making phone calls to their local affiliates. Legal experts were beginning to weigh in on social media about the case, and feminist bloggers were already writing pieces about workplace harassment and the right to self-defense. Sarah Martinez had wanted to stand up for herself against one bully in a small-town diner. Instead, she was about to become a national symbol for everyone who had ever been harassed, intimidated, or made to feel powerless by someone who thought they could get away with it. The quiet waitress from Millbrook was about to discover that sometimes when you refuse to be a victim, the whole world takes notice. Sarah Martinez first realized that her life had changed forever when her phone started ringing at 6 o'clock that evening while she was studying for her pharmacology exam. The call was from a number she didn't recognize, and, when she answered, a woman with a crisp professional voice introduced herself as a producer from a national television news program. "Ms. Martinez, we've seen the video of what happened at the diner today, and we'd like to interview you for tonight's broadcast. This story is going viral, and we think the public would be very interested in hearing your side of what happened." Sarah sat in stunned silence for a moment before asking, "What video?" By the time she hung up the phone 10 minutes later, Sarah had learned that footage of her confrontation with Derek Paulson had been viewed over 2 million times in less than 8 hours. The producer had sent her links to dozens of news articles, social media posts, and blog entries that were all discussing the incident at Murphy's Diner. The hashtag #SaveSarah was trending on multiple social media platforms, and legal experts were debating the case on television talk shows. Sarah's first instinct was panic. She had never wanted to be famous, especially not for punching someone unconscious. She was a nursing student who worked at a diner to pay her bills. She wasn't equipped to handle national attention or media scrutiny. But, as she began to read through some of the online coverage, she realized that something much bigger than her personal situation was happening. The video had struck a nerve with people across the country who had their own stories of workplace harassment, bullying, and situations where they had felt powerless to defend themselves. Women were sharing their experiences in the comments sections of news articles. Men were talking about times they had witnessed harassment and wished they had intervened. The incident at Murphy's Diner had become a catalyst for conversations about power, respect, and the right to defend yourself that were happening in communities everywhere. But not all the attention was positive. Derek Paulson had also been talking to reporters, and his version of events painted Sarah as an unstable, violent woman who had overreacted to a harmless prank. He was claiming that he had been the victim of an unprovoked attack and that the media was unfairly taking sides against him. "I was just trying to cool her down because she looked hot and tired," Derek told a local news reporter. "It was meant to be funny, but she went crazy and attacked me. Now everyone's acting like I'm some kind of monster, but I'm the one who got knocked unconscious." Derek's interview had generated its own wave of online response, most of it negative. People who had seen the full video were not buying his claim that dumping ice water on a waitress was a harmless prank. But his media appearances were complicating the narrative and making Sarah's situation more contentious than she had expected. The phone in Sarah's small apartment continued to ring throughout the evening. Reporters from newspapers, television stations, and online media outlets all wanted to interview her. Legal experts wanted to discuss the case with her. Women's rights organizations wanted to invite her to speak at their events. The mayor of Millbrook called to offer his support and to let her know that the town was proud of her for standing up for herself. But the most surprising call came from Tom Bradley, an attorney from the state capitol who specialized in employment law and sexual harassment cases. Ms. Martinez, I've been following your story, and I think you might have grounds for a significant lawsuit against your employer and against Mr. Paulson, Tom said. The harassment you described in the news reports suggests a pattern of behavior that your employer should have addressed long before it escalated to yesterday's incident. Sarah had never considered the possibility of a lawsuit. She had been focused on keeping her job and getting through nursing school, not on legal action. But, as Tom explained the legal concepts of hostile work environment and the employer's responsibility to protect workers from harassment, Sarah began to understand that what had happened to her was not just personal, it was part of a larger pattern of workplace abuse that affected millions of people. I don't want money, Sarah told Tom. I just want to be able to do my job without being bothered. This isn't just about money, Tom replied. This is about making sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to other people. Your case could set an important precedent for how employers handle harassment complaints. While Sarah was grappling with these conversations, Derek Paulson was dealing with his own consequences. The video had made him instantly recognizable throughout the region, and not in a good way. People recognized him at the grocery store, at gas stations, and at his job sites. Most of the recognition came in the form of hostile stares and negative comments. Derek's uncle, who owned the construction company where Derek worked, called him into his office the day after the incident. Derek, this video is everywhere, and it's not good for business. Customers are calling to ask if we're the company that employs the guy who harasses waitresses. I can't have this kind of attention. Derek found himself suspended from work pending a company investigation into his conduct. The suspension was supposed to be temporary, but, as the negative publicity continued to mount, it became clear that Derek's employment situation was becoming as precarious as Sarah's had been. Meanwhile, Murphy's Diner was experiencing an unexpected surge in business. People were driving from neighboring towns to eat at the restaurant where the famous confrontation had taken place. Some customers came hoping to meet Sarah and show their support. Others came simply out of curiosity about the location where the viral video had been filmed. The owner of Murphy's Diner, Frank Murphy, found himself in an awkward position. Sarah was his employee, and he was generally supportive of her actions in defending herself. But the sudden media attention was disruptive to his business, and he was concerned about the long-term effects of being known as the place where someone got knocked unconscious. Sarah, I'm not mad at you for what you did, Frank told her when she came in for her next scheduled shift. That guy had it coming, and everyone knows it. But this media circus is getting out of hand. I've got reporters calling me every hour wanting to interview you or film in the restaurant. Sarah understood Frank's concerns, but she was also frustrated by the implication that she was somehow responsible for the media attention. She hadn't asked for any of this coverage, and she certainly hadn't wanted to become a public figure. All she had done was defend herself when someone humiliated her. The situation became more complicated when Sarah arrived at work that Friday to find a group of protesters gathered outside Murphy's Diner. About 20 people were holding signs that read "Support Sarah" and "No More Harassment." They were chanting slogans about workers' rights and women's safety, and they were attracting even more media attention to the restaurant. At the same time, a smaller counter-protest had formed across the street. These protesters, mostly men, were holding signs that said Derek is the real victim and violence is not the answer. The two groups were shouting at each other, creating a scene that looked more like a political rally than a quiet breakfast spot in a small town. Sarah stared at the protesters through the diner window and felt overwhelmed by how quickly her personal situation had spiraled into something much larger and more complicated than she had ever imagined. She had punched someone who was harassing her, and now strangers were protesting about her life in front of her workplace. I can't do this, Sarah told Maria, who was standing beside her watching the crowd outside. I just wanted him to stop bothering me. I didn't want all this. Maria put her arm around Sarah's shoulders and squeezed gently. Honey, whether you wanted it or not, you've become a symbol for a lot of people who feel powerless. That's a big responsibility, but it might also be an opportunity to make things better." As Sarah watched the protesters and the reporters and the curious onlookers gathering outside Murphy's Diner, she began to understand that she had reached a crossroads. She could try to retreat from the public attention and hope that the media storm would eventually blow over. Or she could embrace her unexpected role as a voice for people who had experienced harassment and use her platform to try to create positive change. The decision she made would affect not only her own future but also the larger conversation about workplace harassment that her moment of self-defense had started. Sarah Martinez, the quiet nursing student who had just wanted to be left alone to do her job, was about to discover that sometimes the most important fights are the ones you never planned to have. 3 days after knocking Derek Paulson unconscious, Sarah made a choice that would define the rest of her story. She decided to stop running from the attention and start using it. She scheduled her first television interview and began working with Tom Bradley to file a formal lawsuit against Derek and Murphy's Diner. Sarah Martinez was no longer just a waitress who had defended herself. She was becoming an advocate for everyone who had ever been told to smile and endure behavior that made them feel unsafe, disrespected, or powerless. And the whole world was watching to see what she would do next. 6 months after the incident at Murphy's Diner, Sarah Martinez stood in front of a mirror in her new apartment, adjusting the blazer she would wear to her first day of work as a patient advocate at Millbrook General Hospital. The woman staring back at her looked different from the exhausted waitress who had been studying nursing textbooks between coffee refills and dealing with Derek Paulson's harassment. This woman looked confident, purposeful, and ready to change the world. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. The weeks following the viral video had been a whirlwind of interviews, legal meetings, and public appearances that left Sarah feeling overwhelmed and out of her depth. She had finished her nursing degree while simultaneously becoming the face of a national conversation about workplace harassment, and there were many days when she questioned whether she was strong enough to handle the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. The lawsuit against Derek Paulson and Murphy's Diner had been settled out of court for a substantial sum that Sarah chose not to disclose publicly. More importantly to her than the money, the settlement included provisions requiring Murphy's Diner to implement comprehensive anti-harassment training for all employees and to establish clear policies for handling customer complaints about inappropriate behavior. Derek Paulson had faced his own consequences. After being fired from his uncle's construction company, he had struggled to find steady employment in the Millbrook area. The viral video had made him recognizable to potential employers, and most were reluctant to hire someone associated with workplace harassment. He had eventually moved to another state to start over, but not before issuing a public apology to Sarah that many people considered too little, too late. "I realize now that my behavior was wrong and that what I thought was funny was actually hurtful and threatening," Derek had said in a statement read by his lawyer. "I want to apologize to Sarah Martinez for the months of discomfort I caused her and for the incident that led to this situation. I'm getting counseling to better understand how my actions affect other people." Sarah had accepted the apology publicly, but privately she remained skeptical about Derek's sincerity. She had learned enough about the psychology of harassment to know that genuine change required more than a public statement, and she suspected that Derek was more sorry about the consequences he faced than about the harm he had caused. The media attention had eventually died down, as media attention always does, but it had left lasting changes in Sarah's life. She had received job offers from across the country, speaking invitations from universities and women's organizations, and opportunities to advocate for policy changes related to workplace harassment. Most surprisingly, she had discovered that she enjoyed public speaking and had a talent for explaining complex legal and social issues in terms that regular people could understand. The position at Millbrook General Hospital was perfect for her new sense of purpose. As a patient advocate, she would work with people who felt powerless in medical settings, helping them navigate the healthcare system and ensuring that their voices were heard. It was a role that combined her nursing education with her passion for helping people who felt voiceless or ignored. Her supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, had been enthusiastic about hiring Sarah despite, or perhaps because of, her notoriety. "What happened to you at the diner resonated with so many of our female staff members," Dr. Walsh had said during Sarah's interview. They saw someone who looked like them, who had a job like theirs, standing up for herself in a way they wished they could. That kind of courage and authenticity is exactly what we need in this position. Sarah's first case as a patient advocate involved helping an elderly woman named Rose Patterson who was struggling to get answers about her husband's treatment after a stroke. Rose felt intimidated by the doctors and nurses, afraid to ask questions or advocate for her husband's needs. She reminded Sarah of her younger self, someone who had been conditioned to be polite and accommodating even when it wasn't in her best interests. "Mrs. Patterson, you have every right to understand what's happening with your husband's care," Sarah told her during their first meeting. "The medical team works for you and your family, not the other way around. Let's make sure you get the answers you need." Over the course of several weeks, Sarah helped Rose navigate the complex medical decisions involved in her husband's care. She attended doctor meetings with Rose, helped her prepare questions in advance, and made sure that Rose's concerns were addressed rather than dismissed. When Rose's husband was ready to be discharged, Sarah worked with the family to ensure they had the support and resources they needed for his recovery at home. "I never would have been able to do this without you," Rose told Sarah after her husband's successful discharge. "You helped me find my voice when I didn't even know I had lost it." Those words meant more to Sarah than any of the national media coverage or legal settlements. She was making a difference in individual people's lives, one conversation at a time, and that felt more meaningful than being a symbol or a spokesperson. Sarah's evenings were often spent responding to emails and messages from people around the country who had seen her story and wanted to share their own experiences with harassment or to ask for advice about standing up for themselves. She tried to respond to as many as possible, offering encouragement and practical suggestions for dealing with difficult situations. One email that particularly moved her came from a young woman named Jessica who worked at a retail store in Ohio. Jessica described months of inappropriate comments from a male coworker and her manager's unwillingness to address the situation. She was afraid to complain more forcefully because she needed her job, but the harassment was affecting her mental health and her ability to do her work effectively. Sarah spent an hour crafting her response, sharing resources for reporting workplace harassment and encouraging Jessica to document every incident in writing. She also put Jessica in touch with a local women's rights organization that could provide legal advice and support. 3 months later, Jessica emailed again to report that her harassing coworker had been fired and that her workplace had implemented new policies to prevent similar situations. The ripple effects of Sarah's moment of self-defense continued to spread in ways she was still discovering. Murphy's Diner had become a model for small businesses implementing anti-harassment policies, and Frank Murphy regularly spoke to other restaurant owners about the importance of protecting employees from difficult customers. The video of Sarah's confrontation with Derek was still used in workplace training programs across the country as an example of what happens when harassment is allowed to escalate. More personally, Sarah's relationship with her mother had deepened as a result of the experience. Elena Martinez had always been proud of her daughter's strength and determination, but seeing Sarah stand up to Derek and then handle the media attention with grace had given her a new appreciation for the woman her daughter had become. "You know, Mija, when you were little, I used to worry that you were too quiet, too willing to let other people treat you badly," Elena told Sarah during one of their weekly dinners. "I thought maybe I hadn't taught you to be strong enough. But I was wrong. You were always strong. You just needed the right moment to show it." Sarah's experience had also led to unexpected friendships and connections. She had met other women who had gone viral for standing up to harassment, and they had formed an informal support network for dealing with the unique challenges of unwanted fame. She had also connected with researchers and policy advocates who were working on larger systemic changes to address workplace harassment. On this particular morning, as Sarah prepared for her first day at the hospital, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that humid Wednesday morning when Derek Paulson had walked into Murphy's Diner with a bucket of ice water. She thought about the person she had been then, tired, stressed, focused on just getting through each day without making waves. That person seemed like a stranger now. The Sarah who looked back at her from the mirror was someone who understood her own worth, who knew how to set boundaries, and who wasn't afraid to use her voice when something was wrong. The transformation hadn't been comfortable or easy, but it had been necessary. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Maria, who still worked at Murphy's Diner but was now the assistant manager and the point person for the restaurant's new employee safety policies. "Good luck on your first day, Chica," the message read. "Remember, you've got this. You've already proven you can handle anything." As Sarah walked out of her apartment and toward her car, she passed a group of teenage girls waiting for the school bus. One of them recognized her and whispered something to her friends, who all turned to look. A few years ago, that kind of attention would have made Sarah uncomfortable. Now she simply smiled and waved, understanding that her story had become part of these girls' understanding of what was possible for them. Sarah Martinez drove to work that morning thinking about the patients she would help that day, the policies she might be able to change, and the conversations she would have that could make someone feel less alone in a difficult situation. She thought about Derek Paulson too, hoping that wherever he was, he had genuinely learned something from their confrontation and was treating people better than he had in the past. But, mostly, Sarah thought about the future. She had learned that standing up for yourself once makes it easier to stand up for yourself again. She had discovered that her quiet nature wasn't weakness, it was simply the way she gathered strength before using her voice when it mattered most. The woman who had once apologized to doors she walked into had become someone who opened doors for others. And that transformation, more than any viral video or legal settlement, was the real victory in Sarah Martinez's story. As she pulled into the hospital parking lot and prepared to begin the next chapter of her life, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in her ability to handle whatever challenges came next. Derek Paulson had meant to humiliate her with a bucket of ice water, but instead he had awakened something in her that would benefit countless other people who needed someone to stand up for them. Sometimes the best revenge is becoming the person your antagonist never expected you to be. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stay quiet when the world expects you to accept what you don't deserve.